Warning: the following presentation contains crime scene details of actual murder scenes and graphic details not suitable for children. Viewer discretion is advised.
On December 26th at approximately half past midnight, I responded to road in reference to a reported sound of gunfire. Upon my arrival on the scene, I parked my patrol car nearest to the residence facing south. I exited my vehicle and began to approach the residence on foot with my handgun drawn. Upon reaching the front door to the residence, I was met by a female subject who was crying hysterically. The female began screaming that people had been shot within the garage of the residence. While I was speaking to this female, several subjects attempted to run out of the residence, and once they observed me, they all stopped running and threw their hands into the air. I asked the group where the victim was and who'd shot them. A male individual within this group reported that the shooter had likely just fled the scene prior to my arrival, and that the victims were within the garage. Near this time, my partner officer arrived on the scene and approached my position. I motioned him with my left hand to circle around the left side of the residence nearest to the garage and to wait for me. I informed the group of individuals that I had encountered within the doorway to remain where they were prior to notifying dispatch that Officer and I were approaching the garage. I joined Officer and we stacked up outside of the door leading into the garage. I nodded my head to Officer, giving him the go-ahead to breach the door, and he did so. We entered the unlocked door to the garage with guns drawn, and upon doing so announced our presence. I immediately observed two individuals, both of whom seemed to be lying on the floor. I approached the individual closest to me, who was lying on his back attempting to gasp for air, but was bleeding profusely out of his mouth. I yelled to Officer that my subject was still alive, and holstered my weapon prior to kneeling beside the subject and cradling his head upon my thigh. The subject appeared to be experiencing agonal breathing and was not acknowledging my presence. He was shaking his head back and forth violently while gasping and appeared to be in the process of dying. I observed a large wound which appeared to be a gunshot wound upon the upper left side of the subject's head as I attempted to speak to him. Officer shouted from the other side of the garage, informing me that his subject was apparently deceased. He reported that the subject appeared to have been shot multiple times, including in the chin. I yelled back to him to call EMS for my subject, and at that time observed a black handgun lying beside where I'd found my first victim. Approximately 1 minute later, EMTs entered the garage and requested for me to move this handgun so that they could work on the victim. I put on nitrile gloves and moved the handgun by sliding it with the back of my hand approximately 2 feet from where I'd discover it, nearest to an adjacent wall. The first victim was loaded onto a stretcher and was transported to a local area hospital for treatment. I remained with the handgun I'd moved until Detective arrived with the crime lab. Once I'd been relieved of maintaining the chain of custody of the firearm, my supervisor instructed me to strip off any bloody uniform items and to go clean up. That concluded my involvement in this case. On December 26th, I was assigned as a homicide detective to the violent crime unit and was called by Captain, who requested my response to a homicide scene located on road. Captain informed me that 2 victims had been shot. I was informed that Detective had also been called in, who would ultimately serve as the lead detective on this case. I then made contact with Detective, who requested me to respond to the department, where I would be required to interview witnesses involved in the case. Upon my arrival, I was notified that patrol officers had transported 3 witnesses to the department. Each of these witnesses was interviewed separately. Below are summarized interviews with these witnesses. Below is a paraphrased summary of the interview conducted at the police department at approximately 1:50 hours in interview room number 1. For the interview in its entirety, please refer to the audio videotaped interview. The first witness advised that he was friends with the victims and that he and several other friends had been crashing at the residence while one of the victims' parents were out of town in the mountains for Christmas. The witness explained that one of the victim's sisters was staying at the house as well while the parents were on vacation. The witness advised that had been keeping marijuana in their garage and that someone had stolen some earlier in the week. He advised that he wasn't sure whether or not this had anything to do with the murders. He reported that earlier in the evening, the group had stopped at a gas station to grab some quick food due to everywhere being closed for observing Christmas Day. He reported that once they'd gotten home, the first victim and the second victim had been smoking in the garage and talking while everyone else had gone to bed. The witness advised that he was upstairs getting ready to go to bed when he heard several loud popping noises, and that initially he believed these sounds to be fireworks due to always setting off fireworks around the house. He reported that he didn't think anything else of the noises until one of his friends ran into the room asking where the gunshots had come from. The witness reported that he and his friends had gone downstairs to check on the other friends and that upon entering the garage, they observed what they believed to be gun smoke in the air and saw both and on the ground bleeding profusely. The witness reported that he immediately ran inside to call 911, but that an officer was already at the door asking what happened. The witness was later explained that someone had already called 911 from several houses down about hearing gunfire and that the officer was close by. The witness was asked if he'd seen any other subjects approaching the residence or if anyone had been seen that he didn't want to name. The witness reported that he never saw anyone else and didn't see a shooter, but that whoever it was must have been quick running out of the house. I asked the witness if he ever knew of either victim carrying a firearm, and he reported that he'd never seen either with a gun. Interview number 2. Below is a paraphrased summary of the interview conducted at the police department at approximately 2:40 hours in interview room number 1. The witness, who is the sister of one of the victims, reported that earlier in the week someone had stolen a large portion of her brother's weed, which he kept within the garage and sold often. The witness reported that she was certain that whoever had stolen this weed earlier in the week had to have killed her brother, and because her brother had been posting about the theft all over social media, daring whoever had stolen it to come back for retribution. She reported that her brother and his friends had left the house near 11 last night to get some food and that she decided to stay home and go to sleep. She reported that she never awoke when her brother got home and only ever woke up after hearing the sounds of her brother's friends running around and screaming that her brother had been shot. She advised that she hadn't seen anyone coming or leaving the house who could have shot her brother, but that she was certain a third person was involved. We asked the witness specifically if anyone had talked about moving anything after the shooting to prevent her brother or her family from being in more trouble than was necessary, and she acted legitimately confused, stating that she hadn't moved anything and didn't know what we were referencing. She requested to call her parents and go home. Interview number 3. Below is a paraphrased summary of the interview conducted at the police department near 3:49 hours in interview room number 1. We asked to run us through his entire day. He advised that he and one of the victims went to the mountains to visit the victim's mother for Christmas and that they'd returned earlier that morning. The witness explained that while they'd been out driving, the victim advised that someone had stolen some weed from his personal supply in the garage sometime earlier in the week, and that he'd been contemplating putting up more posts on social media about it. The witness reported that he advised the victim that that could be a bad idea, and that he shouldn't be inviting trouble over that could get him or his family hurt. The witness reported that he and the group had returned home and that he'd crashed on the couch because he had to be at work early the next morning and didn't want to wake up anyone else upstairs. The witness reported that he was almost asleep when he heard 6 or 7 loud pops coming from outside, and that he believed the noises were fireworks because the victim had bought some earlier in the week and had been lighting them off randomly to scare the family dog. The witness reported that he had observed running down the stairs and that to the garage. The witness reported that he then heard the others in the house screaming the names of the victims prior to running back inside asking where his phone was. The witness reported that he heard a loud knock at the door and that the victim's sister went to it and opened it, and that a police officer was on the other side. The witness was asked if he'd touched or moved anything, specifically a gun or drugs in the garage after they discovered the victims there, and he advised that he hadn't. He advised that he never looked at the bodies in the garage because he was truly terrified of seeing his friends dead. The witness was asked if he knew either of the victims to routinely carry a firearm, and he advised that he'd never seen either with a gun. The witness was asked if there was any personal controversy between the victims, and he advised that they were best friends and had been since they were about 5 years old. He advised that they'd never argued that he knew of and were always hanging out with each other. Conclusion. Following the interviews, I completed a search warrant which requested permission from the court to search the residence where the homicides had occurred and for several vehicles which were parked in front of the same. This search warrant was signed and issued by judge and was executed at the residence near 8 o'clock that morning. On December 26th, I was employed as a homicide detective with the Violent Crime Unit and was working in an on-call capacity. At approximately 1:15 in the morning, Patrol Captain called my work phone and notified me that a homicide had occurred on the road and requested my response. I requested Captain to call Detective also, who was working rotation on call with me, while I got awoke and dressed to brief him of the situation. Once the interviews of the witnesses had been completed at the police department, I directed Detective to draft and apply for a search warrant for the house. I was informed later that the search warrant was ready to be served, and I rendezvoused with Detective and patrol officers on scene back at the residence. We were joined by the crime lab. The warrant was executed near 8 o'clock in the morning. We made entry through a side gate which led into the backyard of the residence. Of note, the first victim located by officers upon their initial sweep of the residence had already been transported away by EMS and had been declared dead by EMTs mid-transit to the hospital. The second victim located by officers was still on scene and had been declared dead on the scene by initial responding units and EMTs. The victim on scene was located on the concrete flooring of the garage and had obvious gunshot injuries. Blood had pooled and collected around the victim's mouth and head. 4 spent shell casings were located between the victim's legs on the ground, and all were of the same make and caliber. 2 holes left by projectiles were located within the wall of the garage behind the victim. The firearm, which had been located on scene near the first victim, which had been located, contained ammunition of an exact caliber and model of the spent casings, and was absent 6 rounds to make a full capacity magazine. The occupants within the residence had reported hearing as many shots. There was blood spatter located on the muzzle of the firearm, indicating that it was likely fired close range to one of the victims. There was no indication of the presence of a third-party shooter on the scene, and no other firearm had been located on scene throughout our entire search. While all occupants who were interviewed suggested that a third party was the most likely suspect, no evidence on scene indicated this, especially considering that the only spent casings on scene matched those located within the only firearm there. There was no evidence of a struggle either anywhere on scene. While searching the remainder of the garage, we located a black banker's box which contained a large amount of U.S. currency, 2 cell phones, marijuana in bags, and 2 digital scales. The presence of these items further places the motive of a robbery turned homicide highly into question. Following the search warrant, I made contact with one of the victim's mothers and asked if her son and were having any ongoing feuds. His mother reported that the two of them were best friends, but that her son had recently brought issues regarding him contemplating suicide to her attention. His mother reported that she didn't believe that her son would ever take his own life and that he never owned or held a firearm in his life. When asked if she was aware that her son was a homosexual, his mother became defensive and advised that she knew he was gay, but that he would never hurt anyone because of this or himself. I spoke next to the victim's stepfather, who advised that he had also known his stepson to be homosexual. He advised that his stepson had asked him about handguns earlier in the month, but that he'd only brought it up once and that he had no idea where he'd get the money to buy a gun. Later in the day, I was contacted by Mrs., who advised that she believed that her firearm had been used in the homicide earlier in the morning. Mrs. advised that one of the victims had been living with her and her grandson, and that when she'd awoken to the news, she checked her purse where she always kept the gun. Mrs. advised that her handgun had been missing, and when she advised the make and model of the gun, I confirmed that the same make and model firearm had been located and recovered on scene via lab reports. I didn't advise her that this was the case to keep the information confidential. I thanked her for her time and informed her that I'd be in touch with her soon. Later that evening, I was contacted by the medical examiner, who reported that he believed the gunshot wound discovered upon the first victim located to be a single self-inflicted gunshot wound. The medical examiner advised that powder residue and a muzzle imprint had been located on the wound. Below is a paraphrased summary of the second interview conducted at the police department on 12/27 near 9:30 in the morning within the same interview room. The decision to interview this witness again was made due to obvious discrepancies between the information he had provided during his first interview and the information we'd obtained following our thorough examination of the crime scene. There were pieces of information that I discovered related to the relationship between the two decedents that was incongruous with the characterization I'd received from this witness earlier. The personal background information that I'd received from family members and other friends of the two deceased subjects suggested a clearer motive than that of a third party being involved. Upon entering the room and sitting down to speak with the witness, he began crying and stated that he knew that had a gun the entire time, but had no idea that had died, and stated that he was covering for him because he didn't want to get him into trouble. The witness advised that had told him that he'd borrowed the gun from another friend's grandmother and for him not to tell anyone. When asked why he thought would need a gun, he reported that he'd informed the witness that it was for protection because someone had broken into the garage and had stolen some weed the week prior and that was getting antsy about it and was scared. The witness was asked to provide an idea of what he thought might have occurred, and he became very defensive, stating that we knew what had happened and that we knew who had shot both people. He made reference to the fact that we knew that there were 6 bullets missing from the gun involved prior to breaking into tears and asking if he could leave. On 12/28, I attended the autopsies for both subjects in this case at the state medical examiner's office. The attending doctor reported that had sustained a single gunshot wound to his head, which she believed was self-inflicted for several reasons. The doctor reported that the presence of a muzzle imprint on the entry wound beneath the chin of the subject indicated as much, and that other than the exit wound on the left side of the top of the head, the subject was free of injuries. The doctor advised that the second subject had a total of 5 gunshot entry wounds. There were no other injuries to suggest that an altercation had occurred. Documentation of these wounds was as follows: 2 penetrating gunshot wounds to the head, 3 perforating gunshot wounds to the torso, and one perforating gunshot wound to the right arm. Investigative summary. Upon reviewing all physical evidence on scene, speaking with multiple involved parties and witnesses, and receiving results from the medical examiner and autopsies, it is the professional investigative conclusion that was the sole offender in this case, who, for reasons largely unknown, obtained a firearm and had been carrying the firearm for an unknown reason, and that in the early morning hours of the 26th, and the victim had been sitting within the garage of the residence in question prior to standing up and shooting the victim a total of 5 times prior to turning the same firearm upon himself and committing suicide. Certain characterizations obtained from several relatives, close friends, and co-workers seem to suggest that had always had romantic feelings towards the victim, and that the two had discussed this with their individual family members on a few occasions previously. 2 witnesses reported that they had been advised by the suspect that he and the victim had previously argued over this matter, and that in one instance the victim had actually punched the suspect in the face when the suspect had attempted to embrace him after an emotional argument. The police were never called regarding this incident, and it was never documented officially. With this information, a potential motive related to unrequited love emerges from the criminal actions involved in this case, and this conclusion seems to be the only one that has withstood other pieces of evidence, both direct and circumstantial. Despite these findings, both families seem to be in strict denial at this time regarding the idea that could have shot his supposed best friend, who had expressed romantic feelings towards on multiple occasions. I have outlined the explicit case details and evidence related to this conclusion to both families, and it is my hope that in time they arrive at an objective standpoint. Of note, the autopsy for the suspect also returned amounts of lysergic acid within his body at the time of his death. This may have been an additional factor which influenced his decision to enact violence upon the victim and himself without otherwise normal inhibitions. The findings in this case highly attest to this chain of events occurring, and highly discredits the presence of a third-party shooter of any kind. Due to these findings, it is my recommendation that this case be closed pending a review by the unit commander. Upon the submission of this report, it is my recommendation that this case be closed with the classification, death of offender.